Some of you may become somewhat uncomfortable as parts of this film unfold, but I think if you listen carefully...
Nature has intended
Today,
that you
everybody
have to
has
be a
nature.
supreme
Talk about sex
person.
A healthy, happy sex life is the most wonderful and
terribly
exciting.
unpleasant.
We've all experienced curiosity about ourselves and the opposite sex. Who hasn't?
Hello, my lovelies. I'm Megan.
I'm Marcella.
And I'm Colin.
And welcome to Remedial Sex
Remedial
Ed.
Sex Education for
See, we
children.
did so good.
Okay, first podcast.
We
First
got
episode.
it. Nailed it.
Welcome to our educational sex podcast.
Yes, educational with big old scare quotes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're trying.
The three of us, we have an actress, an English major, and a lighting designer taking you on a journey through their own personal sexual education. None of us are doctors. None of us are therapists. None of us are really trained professionals.
No, this is more us trying to educate ourselves because I think we all went to the same schools, and I think we got a very bad sex education.
I'm
So
not
we're
sure
trying to...
We got sex education.
Oh, yeah. I mean, exactly.
Yeah.
So we're just trying to bring you, dear sweet listener, on this journey to enlightenment with us. And by the end, we're all gonna be so enlightened, we'll be like sexy Buddhas, sexual Buddhas.
That's all I've ever wanted to be.
Everyone I've kind of workshopped this idea with has had such a positive reaction to the idea. I don't think we all three of us went to public school in Utah, but I don't think that lack of sexual education is just a Utah problem.
I think it's definitely a U.S. problem, and I think it starts with just our culture around sex in general.
Agreed.
Oh, totally.
And due to the overwhelmingly positive reaction, if this podcast sucks, it's us. So let's go through and kind of talk about each of our attitudes regarding sex to kind of kick us off for episode 1. So I consider myself a very sex positive person. I've always been that way. My parents were very frank with me regarding sex growing up. They tried to keep it as guilt-free as possible. And as equipped as I was with sex, the second I started researching it for this podcast, I realized I know nothing, right? There's just so much information out there, so much that so many wrong beliefs I had for years. So actually researching and sitting down and talking with professionals has been really helpful for me. And that's kind of where I stand. I am a sex positive monogamist.
Very good.
Yeah. Okay, I'll go next. I would consider myself very sex positive. I would say I'm the most free with her love out of the few of us on this podcast right now. Yeah, no, I definitely I'm bisexual. I am a huge proponent of kink. I'm sure I'll talk about that eventually. And then, yeah, I have a lot of partners. I like having a lot of partners. I don't do monogamy very often. But I definitely believe in everybody enjoy what makes you happy, yo. But yeah, so I think that's me in a nutshell.
Cool. And I am married to Megan.
Woo!
I'm Colin.
Gross.
See, it's V gross.
So gross.
I'm a recovering Protestant, and so I have, like, for most of my life, I was not very sex positive, and I am, trying to make up in wokeness in my late 20s. And, doing this podcast, or just doing the research for this pod, has been really enlightening, and I loved listening to the interview that we're going to jump into in a little bit here, and yeah, I am really a babe in the woods in a lot of ways, and so I am trying to learn, and I think that's what's going to make this really fun.
Between the three of us, it really is a very widespread spread of opinions and experience that we're going to have throughout this journey, which I'm very excited about, and kind of why I specifically asked Colin and Marcella to do this with me is there's going to be some topics that they completely agree on, and there's going to be some where they have two completely different takes on it.
I'm ready. Let's battle.
Yes. And Megan will be the solid center between us, the captain of the SS Sex Pod.
I'm obsessed with SS Sex Pod.
And then the other thing is, all three of us have known each other for a very long time.
VV long, yeah.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is Colin and I actually grew up going to church together. I am no longer a Protestant. I don't know if recovering Protestant really would describe me, because I've gone so far the other way. But I think it's interesting to see how we were raised in very similar households with similar belief systems, and we totally grew out of that in completely different ways. And then Megan, I think, is definitely the one who had the most comfortable relationship with sex growing up. So I think we're an interesting group of randoms. 3
random people off the street ready to tell you how to have sex.
Yes.
Oh, I'm so in. I got you.
Okay, let's jump straight in. Our first episode, whenever you start anything, you should always start at the beginning. And we are assuming that our listeners are well-versed in the basics of puberty and how their bodies went through changes when they were between 12 and 14 years of age. So we're going to skip menstruation, we're going to skip hormones, hair in weird places. We assume that you are familiar with all of that. You have a body, you've been experiencing it for a long time. We don't need to go through the basics. So in regards to sex, I would say that step 1 should always be consent.
Yes.
Totally.
I think even with all of the things that you just mentioned as basics, consent comes before all of that, because it has...
Oh, totally.
Yeah, like there's so much before sex that you need to have partners and people in your life that listen to you and listen to what you're comfortable with. So I think consent is number 1 at everything.
I can comfortably say that we were not taught consent in a sexual premise in school, but when I think of the first time I was taught consent, it dates back all the way to kindergarten, with that idea that you don't touch someone without their permission. You can't go over and pull someone's hair or stick their finger up their nose. That is the very basic level of consent. It starts from childhood of, keep your hands to yourself. Consent is defined as permission for something to happen or agreement to do something. And this spans across all things. I already mentioned, the very basic don't touch someone without their permission, all the way to don't borrow an object without explicit consent from the person who owns it. And when it comes into sex, it's the confirmation of any physical activity before you engage in it.
Yeah.
The theory of consent is simple enough. Do not physically pursue those who are not sexually interested in you. Only pursue those who are capable of giving legal consent. Persons underage or those who are intoxicated or are not capable of giving legal consent. You will find that in most cases, employees are not in a position where they can easily give consent to their employers, and this applies to all mentor-mentee relationships. If you've asked someone on a date and the person says yes, that is not permission to have sex with them. At an appropriate time, somewhere between making out and taking your clothes off, you should obtain a verbal confirmation of consent to advance further. If they respond with a blushful, "Oh, I don't know," or "Isn't what we're doing right now nice?" or "Do you think we should?" it's safer to count those answers as a no.
Definitely.
If someone asks you if you want to have sex with them, and you want to have sex with them, you should say yes. In terms of consent, you should always feel comfortable to voice what you want, but you are also required to listen to the needs and wants of the person you are sexually attracted to.
Yeah, and you definitely touch on that in your interview, but I do think it's equally important to highlight the ways we can say yes, as it is to highlight the ways we can say no. One thing that I I had a really hard time with saying yes, just because of my own sexual baggage and the sexual shame that I accrued over the years. It was hard for me, even when I was really into someone, to say yes to having sex with them.
I agree, and I think throughout school, we hear the phrase "no means no" time and time again, and I think it gets shouted from the rooftops just because there's a surprising amount of people out there who don't understand or grasp the concept.
Don't take no for a no.
with the whole, one of the downsides of only promoting no means no is it puts sex in this really scary, almost demonized place, and when you want to have it makes you feel bad. Like, it makes you question what's wrong with me. Why am I so positive and ready for this? Does it make me a sinful person, or does it make me dirty in ways? When actually, no, it's not the case. Like, if you want to have sex, then
Go for it.
yeah, if you have a consenting partner,
Yes.
that's fantastic.
And of course, you should wear a condom,
Yes.
which is...
We'll get to that.
And that's
yeah,
episode
sorry.
2.
That's episode 2.
So, Marcella, what are your takes on the whole no means no, yes means yes?
I think that women, especially, I mean, I'm not unique in thinking this. Women are taught never to say no. So I'm really glad that you voiced other ways as to how women mean no, but are incapable of feeling comfortable saying it. Because I think, I mean, I've definitely been in plenty of situations where I was like, I don't really know if this is what I want to do. But like, when you get to that point, it's like, oh, but you've brought this person this far. Like, why are you turning around? Like, all of that kind of internal shame. So I think it's, really important to just be aware of your partner and to see when somebody's uncomfortable to say what they mean. Like, of course, in an ideal world, like, we would confidently be like, yo, this is what I'm comfortable doing. And I hope that everybody goes out and tries to grow their confidence to do that. But I think, like you were saying, Megan, we need to listen to our partners and hear if they're saying, well, and backing away in that sense.
Well, my experience, and if you two think I'm incorrect in this belief, my experience is if someone is down for the next step, they're enthusiastic about it. Mm-hmm. So if you're pursuing them and they're in that kind of uncomfortable shakiness, or like, that's not a yes.
That's definitely not a yes.
It's not a yes.
I think, like, movies and society have kind of tricked us into believing there's, like, more coyness about sex in the real world than there actually is. Like, there's lots of, like, I don't know, oh, stop.
Will they, won't they?
Yeah, will they, won't they? And it's like, no, like, people who want to bone down, just bone down. And it's beautiful. God loves it.
Oh, man. God loves it when you bone down.
We did an interview with Hannah Sharton, who volunteers with LDS LGBT teenagers and tries to teach consent in ways that we can better listen. Let's jump into that now.
Today, everybody tells us we should talk about sex to our children.
Now, I believe you led a class regarding how to approach consent.
Yes, I help facilitate the youth portion of a conference for LGBT Mormons. And last summer, we had a big discussion about consent so that we can make sure that our kids are communicating effectively with any of their partners and making sure that they understand their own boundaries and how to structure them.
What does FRIES stand for?
It's an acronym that's used by Planned Parenthood very commonly. It stands for Freely Given, Reversible, Informed, Enthusiastic, and Specific. And it's a really helpful way of understanding all of the different working parts that happen when you're giving and getting consent. The first letter in that acronym, which is F for freely given, the basis of that is that you're not being pressured or coerced into doing something, and you also are in a state of mind and in control of your body so that you can do that. So that includes stuff like sexual coercion. It includes stuff like not trying to have sex with people when they are drunk or you are drunk or inebriated, stuff like that. The next letter is R, which is reversible. That means that when you're starting some sort of physical or emotional experience with someone, that it's not like getting on a roller coaster where, you're sort of just strapped in for the next 8 minutes of your life and you don't really have the option of opting out. You always have the option of communicating with whomever you're having this experience with and either stopping the situation altogether or changing to something new. And that's like a really important part of like giving and getting consent, is that you can change that. The I is informed consent, which is something that you usually hear in the context of medical treatment. And it normally just means that you know what you're getting into, you know, when you walk into a situation. And that can look like having conversations with your partners about contraception and about protection and about STDs and whether or not, you know, your partners have been tested recently and stuff like that. From an emotional perspective, it can look like content warnings, you know, understanding that we're potentially talking about an emotionally distressing conversation. And so if I have something stressful that I want to talk about with someone that I love, especially people that I don't know particularly well, I'll start it out with, hey, I want to talk about X subject. I know that could be potentially stressful. Do you have the space to talk about that right now? And if they don't have the space to talk about it, then they can tell me and, you know, like, hey, I love you a lot, but I can't do that right now. Or if they do, then they can be like, yes, I am definitely here for that, and I'm here for you, and we can jump into that right now. And then I know that, you know, I don't have to worry about putting too much on the person that I love. You know, that anxiety can be put out of my mind, and I understand and know that have the consent of the other person, and I'm practicing healthy consent throughout my life. So E is enthusiastic. You want to give enthusiastic consent where you can.
Is that kind of to gauge if the person that you're with isn't like gung-ho about the situation, then
exactly,
don't keep going?
Exactly, yeah. Like, I'm sure you'll remember the stuff that was happening with Aziz Ansari recently, where his partner was not enthusiastically into the situation. It sounds like she wasn't into the situation at all. And a part of making sure that your partner or partners are enthusiastically involved is making sure that it's that they are in it, they are excited, yes, in the situation. And that can look like making sure that you're always keeping that open dialogue. It can look like understanding that there are lots of different ways of saying no. It can look like watching your partner's body language. And if you're noticing that someone seems maybe a little bit held back, or like they are unsure, or like they're tensing up and uncomfortable with what's happening, stopping and checking in and making sure that that partner is okay. When we're talking with our youth, one thing that we made sure to have a conversation about, though, was that sometimes when you're exploring your identity, you're not 100% sure what you're going to be fantastically in love with doing. And so enthusiastic in that context, when you're exploring your identity and you're exploring what makes you happy and what you want to be doing, really just looks like being sure that that is what you want to be doing right then. You don't have to know that you're going to love it, but you have to know that you want to be there and you want to be in that moment. And if you decide that you don't want to be in that moment anymore, that's 100% okay, because the earlier letter that we discussed, the R, means that consent is reversible. And so you can try new things and explore new things, even if you don't know that you are emphatically in love with it already, and understand that that's okay and that consent is reversible, so you can stop completely or switch to something else whenever you want to. And then the last letter is specific. Having consent that is specific means that you have consent for that specific scenario, and that consent for that specific scenario doesn't extend to other scenarios.
Yesterday, I think it was you, brought a comparison that sexual consent is very similar to asking to borrow someone's car.
Yeah, we did talk about that yesterday. The metaphor for that is that if you give permission for someone to borrow your car on a Monday, that doesn't necessarily mean that that person can come back on a Wednesday and take your car without telling you because you said it was okay on Monday. So, I mean, that means that it must be okay on Wednesday too. That's not how that works. And that is another situation that involves consent. You consented to let that person borrow your car on the Monday, but that does not mean that you have consented to let that person have your car forever. Yeah. And, you know, like if you take that metaphor and that understanding of how that situation works and put it on an understanding about how sex works, if it makes sense here, it makes sense there too. If it makes sense that someone can't come and take your car because you let them borrow it once and that is their car now and they have complete and unfettered access to it, it makes sense that the same would be true for another person's body. And that's fries.
So, I think that you explained this to me before we did this interview, and my very first initial reaction to it is a lot of this is not only applicable to consent during sex, but it's consent for anything involved in a respectable relationship.
For sure, 100%.
And I was talking to Colin about it afterwards, and it kind of came to this conclusion that in relationships where you kind of hook up first and then get to know each other later, I think it's a warning sign. Like how they treat you with consent in the bedroom is how, if you become more serious later in life, it's a good indication of how they're going to treat consent in terms of, you know, when you meet another person's family for the first time, and there might be certain parts of your identity you're not ready to talk about with your family, or things you don't want brought up around your coworkers, or in other cases, consent when you share a bank account for like big purchases.
For sure.
But again, I come back to this idea that it's really relatable to committed monogamous relationships. How do you feel this translates into more of a hookup culture for those who enjoy sex with multiple partners?
I think that when ethical non-monogamy is in practice, consent is a very, 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 very big part of that. What makes non-monogamy, and especially if you are communicating with multiple partners that you have multiple partners, what makes that ethical and what makes that different from, you know, having a whole bunch of one-night stands or potentially cheating on different partners is that you have that element of consent. And so you're being very expressly communicative with all of your different partners about what's going on and what the boundaries are and what everyone's sexual health is. All of those different things come into play when you're in non-monogamous relationships, and whether it's polyamory or ethical non-monogamy or whatever different words end up being applied to it.
There was a reaction when the whole Me Too movement was going on from, I hope, a small minority of people who have nothing nice to say about them, but this reaction of having to ask explicitly for consent every time can't be sexy. What do you have to say in response to that?
I think they're not thinking particularly creatively about sex then.
Okay.
I think that asking for consent can be very sexy. And it's just that you need to be thinking a little bit more creatively about it. You know, asking about consent doesn't always look like sitting down and like making bulleted lists about what this person is comfortable with and what that person is comfortable with. And it's not as business-like as everyone is making it out to be. It can look like, I'm not going to bedroom voice at you because that'd be a little weird, but it can look like, asking, do you like this? Do you like when I do this? Do you like when I say this? And incorporating that into the flow of things can be very natural and very fun. So I think that maybe it's just that they don't understand consent fully, which I think has a lot to do with the state of sex health and sex ed in America right now. But it's not as complicated as everyone's making it out to be.
I have a tendency to agree with you. I can't think of a single time that someone I'm attracted to, if they whispered into my ear, because there's this like transition moment with sex where you're making out with someone and then there's this moment where you know it's going to the next level. I can't think of a single person who I knew I wanted to go to that next level. If they whispered in my ear, would you like to X? I wouldn't have been all about that.
Right? 100%. You're like, hell yeah, I'm into this. Yeah.
Like, and I think that's actually a good indication. If the person is not all about that, the attraction isn't there, or maybe the attraction is there, they're just not ready yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, a myriad of things could go into play with you not being ready yet. But honestly, if you're not ready yet, that's okay. And you shouldn't have to be ready. And if you genuinely care about the well-being of whomever you're having this experience with, you should care a lot about whether or not they're fully ready. And the sex is better when everyone is like really happy and excited and having a good time doing it.
Absolutely. On the flip side of the enthusiasm, which I think is important to promote, like if you're into this, you should feel comfortable saying yes.
For sure.
There's no shame in that. But on the flip side of this, how do we get the public more comfortable with saying no? Like, I want to flip back to the Aziz incident, because he should have checked in, and she clearly wasn't into it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, how do we get the public more comfortable with saying, please stop?
Yeah. I think that a lot of that has to do with the way that we socialize women and femme people from a physical safety perspective and an emotional perspective. You know, especially in Utah, women are raised to nurture because of the predominant religious environment that we're in. We're raised to put other people's wants and needs in front of our own needs. And I think that that sociological factor has a lot to do with women having a hard time saying no. And then, I mean, I've talked to a lot of women who have, you know, had consistently bad experiences with men in their lives. And so saying no can be really scary because you're afraid for your physical safety. At least that's, I don't know. Is that something that you can empathize with?
Yeah.
Giving people resources to have the ability to protect themselves if they need to.
I would agree with you on the physical fear. I think a lot of women go into, and I also think that there are specific partners where that physical fear is more prevalent than others. I would also say, again, this is something that comes out of the bedroom as well.
Yeah.
Being able as a woman to say no to ridiculous business requests that I think a lot of employers put on you because women are traditionally trying to prove themselves to an X degree more so than men. Being able to say, again, no in a partnership where, you know, we live in a society now where if we're just talking about a traditional cis straight marriage, both husband and wife are expected to work nowadays. The wife being able to say, no, I'm not going to have a full-time job and cook and clean. We're splitting this up.
For sure, 100%.
Sex is one thing that we talk about consent, but it needs to be broadened out to how we reach consent in every aspect of life actually connects back to even the physical aspect of it. Would you agree with that?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I think that, returning to your earlier question, maybe the way that you help people get better at saying no in the bedroom and saying no to sexual situations that they don't want to be a part of is that it's important to learn how to say no in other parts of your life. You know, I've struggled with that a lot, and I've been having, I feel like if it's not something that you learn from a young age, it's something that you have to teach yourself as you get older. That if you don't learn from the time that you're young that it's okay to say no, and that you're allowed to say no to things that you either don't have the space to do or sometimes don't want to do, you know, whatever it is, that's a learned skill that you have to incorporate into your life as an adult. And so I am learning how to do that right now, and I'm learning how to say no to people when they are asking too much of me, or when a situation isn't fair, or when, you know, sometimes I love someone very much and I just don't have the space to give them what they need, and understanding that that's okay. And that honestly has, if I think about my process of learning how to do that, that's definitely impacted my confidence in communicating what I'm comfortable with and what I'm not comfortable with when I'm having sex with someone.
Teaching the kids about trying to not avoid having sex with someone under the influence of drugs and alcohol. Any sexual education book that you pick up will advise not to engage in these materials in sex for multiple reasons. One being, the reason receptors in your brain are totally down. The others being that when you're drunk, your sensations are very dulled. So actually being able to enjoy the full physical pleasure and connectedness of sex is not going to be as intense. However, many people have had sex while drunk, and I can say that my husband and I have engaged while both drunk in this. So is this a subject that gets a little gray and fuzzy line for you, or is there a hard line regarding intoxicating substances?
I think that that's a complicated question that has a complicated answer. I think that in my mind there are multiple reasons why it's not a good idea to have sex with someone who's drunk, or have sex when you're both drunk, or when you're drunk, or any mix of those things. There are multiple elements of consent that are potentially impacted when you're having sex while you're inebriated. One of which is, and probably the biggest one that's impacted, is informed consent. For me, when I am with a partner, my hard line that I discuss with people as sober me is that drunk me may have different opinions, but sober me says that we are not allowed to do things. And I try to be very conscientious of that when I'm inebriated, but work really hard to not do the thing, because lines of communication can be they need to be fluid when you're having sex with someone, and they need to be open, and they need to be changeable. And I don't ever want to find myself in a position where I either feel afraid to or can't communicate that something has changed and that I'm not okay. Because part of being inebriated is that your ability to communicate effectively diminishes. And I don't ever want any of my partners to be in that position either. That being said, I think that there's a difference between being tipsy and being incapacitated. I think that if someone is very clearly slurring their speech and can't stand up and or is very obviously unconscious, you should not be having sex with that person.
To your point, the difference between tipsy and drunk is you can have a couple and definitely being feeling happy and still be able to be very much within a moment, whereas there becomes this point of drunk where that person is no longer within any moment.
I think that's definitely a very real thing, and I think that line can be easier to figure out when you know your partner really well. But if you're experiencing something with someone new, that line can look so different for so many different people. For me, I have a drink and I am a mess because I'm very small and I don't drink very often. And so that line looks very different for me than it would for someone else who, is taller, or it has a different body composition, or drinks more than once every quarter. I think that line can look very different for very different people. I think it's really important to be aware too of the fact that there are some people with predatory behaviors, and it's really common for people to use alcohol like a date rape drug. Where someone will be pushing drinks on someone else in an attempt to lower their boundaries, or in an attempt to make it so that they can't say no. And that's a very important thing to be aware of, and a lot of the reason why there are laws around if a person is drunk and you have sex with them, that counts as rape. Because otherwise there's a lot of societal victim blaming that comes into play. People who are engaging in predatory behaviors will use that as an excuse for, well, I didn't do anything wrong, or, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I do agree with the state law, because you're right, they do use alcohol as kind of an excuse.
Mm-hmm.
And there is no sobriety test for sex. There is no, they cannot implement a legal blood alcohol content level, because by the time the person actually gets to a local official or a friend or anywhere that they can report this incident, they've already sobered up past the moment that the incident happened. How did you talk to the kids about how just because you're in a monogamous relationship doesn't mean that consent is no longer important?
I think that's a very important thing to have a conversation with people about, that your relationship status and the length of your relationship does not necessarily mean that you have consent to do anything with that person. We talked about it as directly as possible, because I think that that's something that has historically been so misunderstood that it's not something that we should be mincing words about. It's important to understand that just because you are in a relationship with someone does not mean that you have immediate, unfettered access to that person's body or emotional energy or time. That person is a person outside of you, and they are allowed to have boundaries, and they're allowed to have their own autonomous control of their personhood. Having continuous conversations about consent is never a bad thing. I would suspect that even in your relationship with your husband, that there's an element of checking in, even if it's not very, very direct and explicitly stated. I would imagine that he's paying attention to your body language, and he's listening to you and your emotional state and stuff like that, and all of that comes into play when you're talking about consent.
Well, I would actually, Colin's he's very in tune with checking in on others just due to his personality, but I would have to say that actually the opposite is true. I have to check in on him a lot more, which we actually didn't talk about. I think in a lot of situations, consent and explicit consent and fear gets placed on the woman in terms of sex. That's not always the case.
Definitely not.
1 in 7 men have been raped or sexually abused in America, and when it comes to terms of whenever they try to say no, I feel as though there are a surprising amount of women out there who don't listen to it.
That's definitely a real thing. And even as I've been having this conversation, I've been primarily talking about this from the perspective of women and femme people. And so that's showing even how ingrained that is in me to not consider that perspective. But that's a very real thing. And every once in a while you'll see, I don't know, would you call them memes making their way around the internet of conversations between men and women where women are having really horrible reactions to their male partners not wanting to be intimate with them. I think that one really valuable thing that you need to have when you're having conversations about this is access to the language necessary to talk about it. And what I mean by that is that my negative experiences with sex had never been people jumping out at me in alleyways. It was people that I knew really well that were communicating things and trying to say a lot of the things that you mentioned earlier. But I didn't have the language to talk about what was happening to me. It wasn't until like a year or two ago that I heard the word sexual coercion and learned that that was a thing that exists. Sexual coercion is when someone is trying to more or less emotionally manipulate you into having sex with them. So that can look like saying stuff like, if you loved me, you would do this. It's okay because I'm your partner. If you don't do this, I'll make your job harder, or I will evict you from where you live, or I will, in the instance of queer folk, I will tell people that you're gay, stuff like that. They're trying to force you to have sex, but in an emotional way, and with their words rather than with their muscle, essentially. Having access to the language to communicate about what's happening to you is a really important part of, I think, changing the dialogue about that. So making sure that everyone has the words that they need to say I'm experiencing this thing with my partner or with people that I've been sexually involved with, and it was really upsetting, and there's a word for that, can be a really empowering thing to have, and can make it so that you can also understand that that's not okay, when you're having those conversations. Because sexual coercion is a form of sexual violence.
Yeah, it is.
And there's not, when you're having conversations about sexual assault, there's not a lot of mention of sexual coercion. And there's a very clear mental picture and societal conversation about what rape looks like, that it is men raping women. There's a very clear picture in society about what sexual assault looks like, and that sexual coercion isn't usually included in that picture.
Well, it's something that I think there's a huge misinformation, and I think it's very media driven. It's like that term, a Lifetime movie. It's usually a very kind of violent exchange. Someone who is stronger than their partner forcibly holding them down, despite cries to stop. And that traditionally isn't what actually happens. Usually it's a very, I'm lucky enough in this life to have never been forcibly raped, but I have in multiple occasions have things happened to me because I freeze in panic, because it is a horrible position where you don't know how to get out. And that's what's probably more common, where someone tries something and you're in such shock of, is this actually happening, that you don't really know how to initiate the, hey buddy, what you doing conversation.
That's very real. Yeah. And I think that one thing that people don't talk about is the fact that, we understand that there's a fight or flight response, but people don't talk about the fact that there's a third option, and that option is freeze. If you are in a situation where you feel unsafe and you feel afraid for your physical or emotional safety, you might fight back, you might try to run away, or you might freeze up and just try to survive the situation. Mm-hmm. And that's a legitimate response to something really scary happening. I think that if I were to give a final piece of advice, it would be that consent is something that you can have in all areas of your life, and that as you learn more about it and as you incorporate it throughout all of your interactions with other people, emotional, physical, just kind of basic affection type things of, hey, can I give you a hug? Can I, give you a high five? Making sure that you are incorporating consent into your daily interactions with other people, so that you're understanding that you're respecting their boundaries, makes having conversations about consent a lot easier when it really, really, really matters to have conversations about consent.
Thank you so much for your time, Hannah. This has been very helpful.
Thank you so much. I'm glad that we were able to chat about this.
But nobody tells us just how.
So, what are our reactions to the interview with Hannah?
I was really impressed. I think the number one thing that I was so excited about listening to Hannah was how she approached consent as a whole, not just regarding sex, especially because she is working with LGBTQ youths. I think it was really important to be you have to tell people what you're comfortable with at every step of the way, and that isn't just at sex. And so hearing her highlight that was probably my favorite.
Yeah, I really liked how she brought consent to an emotional level. If you want to have a serious emotional conversation with someone and they're not in the space where they can really do that, they have the right to say no without you making them feel like they're a bad person because they don't want to engage in that. And that's something I'd never really thought about before, about how we can apply consent to every area of our lives. Marcy, I was interested in hearing what you had to say about enthusiastic consent in the BDSM community.
Oh, yeah. I texted these guys as soon as I listened to the whole, as we were listening to the interview, I was just basically screaming how much I wanted to talk about kink culture and how the dirtiest of us are probably using consent way more than normal couples, at least in my experience. That's how I should speak on this. Because so I'm really into BDSM, and BDSM specifically, you're thinking, oh, like part of it is pushing your boundary. And because I am a submissive and I have had dominant partners, you think, right, like you've given them all of the power, so how are you going to consent in these situations? But part of that is super critical to the relationship. Like the whole point of submissive dominant relationships is the level of trust that you give each other. And you talk about everything ahead of time, especially in the dominatrix world, like scenarios where you're going to hurt the individual. If you're playing with pain play, breath play, all of these different things, you've already negotiated ahead of time, like scenarios that you're going to go into, what you're going to do, what your boundaries are. So that's all talked about first. So you're giving your consent as to what they're capable of doing to your body. And then as the relationship strengthens, the whole point of the dominant person is to be watching your reactions and seeing when is too far, and noticing like little aspects about you that maybe you're just doing subconsciously, and them noticing, hey, okay, I need to pull off and I need to go back, and then checking in. And there's that, like, that's the reason for safe words. Safe words is kind of like consent in the opposite way. I guess, I don't know, is that a good way to explain it? Where it's like, hey, I need to stop. Or
I don't think it's consent in the opposite way, because I think a huge part of consent is retractable.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You know, this idea, you don't know, there's some situations where you don't know you're not going to be okay with it until it's happening to you.
Yeah.
And being able to voice up at that time, no, we gotta stop.
Yeah. So I don't think it's reverse consent. I think it's just regular consent.
Yeah.
You're right. I take it back.
Yeah.
No, but absolutely, you're right. It's consent is just consent, and safe words are a version of consent in this community. And so in my experience, and I'd love to hear what you guys think, in preparation for this episode, I was wondering how often I feel like I have asked for consent in like normal sexual relationships compared to how often I ask for consent when I'm in these like more kinky relationships. And on looking at myself and taking responsibility for my actions, I would say that minimal in normal relationships. It was all body language, and I definitely, I should be checking in more. Like, I feel guilt because I'm realizing I'm not doing enough.
Yeah.
So it's interesting you bring that up, because when you mentioned this to me when we first discussed this as a podcast topic, I of course went back and reflected upon all of my sexual partners to see what my relationship with consent was. And it was luckily in a lot of situations it was pretty good, but I also noticed that there's a huge discrepancy in consent with someone that I was pursuing a relationship with versus someone who is a casual sexual partner. So anyone who was a relationship category, there was a lot of discussion regarding sex. It was a lot slower paced, and there was a lot more communication and confirmation. Whereas someone who I was hooking up with, you're right, a lot of it is dependent on body language, and there isn't much discussion going into it.
Yeah, and that is, I'm really glad that Hannah did bring up body language, but it also kind of makes me uncomfortable that you are typically looking at body language and these sort of subtle cues instead of more explicit cues, and that is something that honestly I would like to apply more, getting explicit consent rather than implicit.
But I also think that explicit consent comes to us in ways that aren't strictly defined. Like, I would classify, it's hard. So we talked about the Aziz Ansari incident in the Hannah interview. Now for me, if you're on a date with someone and the date happens at a public place, and after the date the person you were with invites you up to their place afterwards, to me, that is an explicit question for sex, because in my world, at least, if you're going back to someone's apartment after a date, that implies hanky-panky time.
Yeah, no one needs to drink coffee at 8 or 11. What time do dates end? Boy, howdy, I have been in a relationship for a long time. Well, I mean,
Marcella, what's your take on that?
Yeah, what's your...
I think that's super complicated.
Yeah.
Especially because, okay, like if this is a first date, or you're in early stages of getting to know each other and you invite somebody up, like, you don't know what their comfort level with sex is. They may be interested in coming over and just making out, or maybe you don't know if they're asexual. Like, there's so many other contributing factors that I agree. I think I've always treated a, hey, want to come back up to my place, as a, hey, we're about to get down. Like, that's how I've always interpreted it. But I think that's because I am more sexually free. So that is, I don't know. If I guess what I'm trying to say is, if somebody is more conservative with who they choose to have sex with, an invitation to go back to their place could literally be an invitation to hang out, get to know each other more, talk in a quieter setting, like have a more intimate moment that isn't necessarily sex. So I would say that we actually need to change our thinking on that, because just because we immediately jump to sex doesn't mean that somebody with a more conservative point of view wouldn't.
So I actually have 2 responses to that. So
Game on. Yes.
Okay. I have 2 responses. So first response is, I think there's a difference between inviting someone back to your place after you've already been out for hours and hours versus inviting them over to your place for the date. Like, if they are cooking dinner for you and it is at their apartment, or whatever the date is at their place, that is not an invitation for sex. That's a date.
Sure.
And I think it's a very specific difference versus if you meet someone at a bar and they invite you back, or if, again, to Colin's point, if it's like 11 p.m. and they're inviting you up, that is, to me, clear language. But, and here's the big but, my second response is I'm actually a little hypocritical in the inviting someone back and having it mean sex, because on our second date, I invited Colin back to my place, but it was just to make out and nothing else.
Yeah.
So I guess it's a little hypocritical because it definitely had a physical implication, but also I was very comfortable with defining what was too far. So I think in any circumstance, regardless of whether you're invited back to someone's place, or if you're still in the movie theater, or if you're just on a street, like, being able to clearly, if someone is going further than you originally anticipated, being able in that moment to be like, no, let's just stay here.
Yeah, and sometimes you really do just want to cuddle and watch Netflix. Like, that is a very great experience.
I love that so much.
It's very nice. So yeah, I do think that it is super dangerous to treat the, hey, you want to come back to my place request as always meaning sex, because there's just, and you really have to, I mean, it all comes down to knowing the person and knowing what they would mean like that and what they mean by that. And if you don't know, then you probably don't know the person well enough to be having sex with them, to be quite honest.
Okay, Dad.
Oh. Ooh, I don't know. Yeah. I'm like, yo, I don't need to know you. Anyway.
But you can but usually if you're having a casual relationship, you'd be more upfront about it. You'd say, let's go back to my place for sex. No?
Would you?
I don't know.
No, I don't think. That's not true, because I am a ridiculous human, and sometimes I have 100% been like, so, want a bone? Like, let's get out of here. I think this is when, in any other, if we weren't recording right now, I would go into my tirade on how the internet and texting is ruining face-to-face communication and how nobody knows how to interpret what anybody else is saying anymore.
No, let's go into this tirade, because it does relate.
It's just, like, especially because punctuation is now aggressive, which I hate. Apparently, if I write to you, a text message and end it with a period, I am obviously very upset with you. And it like turns into this big war. And then if you apply that to people don't have phone calls anymore. People don't talk on the phone. People don't spend enough time in person, in my opinion. So we're not meeting strangers the way that we used to. So I think what everybody has forgotten is how to learn. Like, we don't get enough practice learning people's body language when we don't already know who they are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I do think the pervasiveness of technology has made us kind of literal, and we've lost that sort of subtlety of communication that maybe we used to have, or maybe we didn't. I don't know. I don't think things were very good consent-wise before the internet.
Yeah.
But I do think you're making an interesting point.
Yeah. I think if you spend so much of your time reading communication, you've stopped learning how to, like, I don't know, absorb all of these little identifiers from another person's body language.
Mm-hmm. Little subtle signifiers.
Yeah.
However, I don't know. I would always err on the side of getting explicit consent, and it never hurts to check in. Like Hannah said, the sex is better when you're present and you're saying, like, do you like this? Do you like it? Or would you like it if I touched you like this? Or how do you want me to touch you? What do you like? What do you want me to do? You get that communication going, and things, people just open up and things are so much better.
This is something that, again, my kink culture, it is a great way to get people excited. Like, if you're getting ready for a date and you know that you really, really want to have sex with this partner, and you can be like, hey, I'm really excited to do this, this, and this to you, like, and get to know whether or not they're into that, or like build a scenario of like what they're interested in ahead of time. Honestly, you're just, in my opinion, you're just upping the energy that you're going to go into it with. I really, it's so upsetting that people say that consent can kill the mood. If you can kill the mood, the person wasn't into it.
Yeah, like,
Definitely.
so first off, I don't even think it's just a kink thing. Like, I've been very vocal about sex from day one, and that might just, again, be from what we said earlier. Like, I had the least shame of sex growing up, so being able to easily talk about it from the start has kind of helped. But being able to turn to someone and kind of take vocal cues for what they like and what they don't like, double checking, and this might be my own anxiety, double checking that what I'm doing is working for them. And also, I agree, like, that whole implication that getting consent kills the mood or isn't sexy, that's a load of crap. Like,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah, and you know what? I think it all really points to how much coercion is a part of hetero sex. And maybe, maybe some aspects of gay sex as well, but I don't have any. But I do, well, I don't have an experience there, but it does seem like it's, from everything you see in movies and TV, that the men are always having to, like, trick women into having sex with them, or like literally tricking them, like in Revenge of the Nerds. I won't go into detail, but it's a pretty gross movie now. Anyway, or the men have to, like, beg women for sex, or it's just it's all pretty awful. Someone please help me.
So, no, I agree with you. It is very common in the media, like, especially one of my favorite movies is Gone with the Wind, and there's this scene where, Rhett Butler grabs Scarlett, and she's just kind of hitting him on the chest, being like, let me go, in a very 1930s kind of way, and he flings her into his arms, takes her up the stairs. She's obviously upset, but the next morning, after sex has happened, she wakes up and she's like, oh, I'm so relaxed now.
All she needed was some D.
Yeah.
That's all you need.
That's all that those women need.
Yeah, to cure our
To
hysteria.
cure their hysteria.
Yeah, it's just so disappointing.
Be disappointing.
So let's talk about media. Can we bring up any examples of good consent in media, or times when we watched a show and we were like, yes, this is how seduction is supposed to happen?
Definitely not Game of Thrones.
No.
What, the Jon Snow Daenerys thing didn't do it for you?
Oh, I mean, guys, are we ready? I'm ready to find out
Ready
some
for
more.
some incest.
100%. But do I think that Game of Thrones has ever been good at consent? No.
Definitely not. I can't think of any specific examples, Meg, but one conversation I always like to have is that the Joey character is always better than the Ross character. Or like in How I Met Your Mother, Barney is like way better at sex and consent than Ted is.
Is he though?
Well, in my little brain world, I prefer the characters who are upfront about their intentions from the very beginning. And those characters always take a no for an answer. Like, it's played off for laughs. Like, they take no and then move on to the next person. But that's honestly, like, when you're just looking for casual sex, that's a really healthy way to go about it. Like, you take your no and then you move on. And the Ted Mosbys of the world never do that. They mope and whine and they try to trick a woman into having sex with him.
I mean, I am pro Barney and anti Ted, so I am
Fuck Ted Mosby.
However, I mean, we're obviously just, not discussing the fact that Barney is constantly tricking women with his identity.
Constantly.
He is always pretending to be something else.
But I will agree with you in the fact that Joey is a better character than Ross, because in the Friends world, Joey he is solidly a good guy through and through, and you're right, when Rachel turns him down, he's like, okay, we're done. Rachel's a no.
Totally.
Whereas Rachel turns Ross constantly down, and he's constantly being a total dick to her.
Yeah, yes. Yeah,
I think
Barney's
media
not the best example.
is obsessed with this idea of men who are obsessed with women. And I think, God, I just, like, I'm gonna bring it up, but You on Netflix,
Oh, yeah.
You is a great example of how destructive this love affair we have with this kind of character is. Because we have been ingrained to root for the romantic leads, no matter the circumstance. Like in the Twilight series, Edward literally breaks into her bedroom and watches her sleep. That's not consent, but isn't that attractive? We're obsessed with these toxic relationships, so I think that's why we're not able... I think it's really sad that we're not able to be like, oh, this one scene was really hot and they were 100% both into it and like made a verbal confirmation of it.
I can't think of a movie where that happens, honestly.
I have a couple of examples.
Oh!
I'm actually surprised that Colin didn't bring this up, because he talks about it all the time. Tell me about Riker from Star Trek, Colin.
Oh, of course. Riker loves consent. He is such a great... He is, especially if you headcanon it a little bit, but he's a pretty great role model in that he is literally turned off by situations where someone is trying to coerce him, or like, or he doesn't get explicit consent. Also, he's just like a pansexual, space traveling, beautiful bearded man.
He is one of the most beautiful people who's ever been on that show. His eyes pierced directly into your soul.
But yeah, Riker's a pretty good example, especially because he bones down with everyone and everything.
I think Riker's actually a phenomenal example of how consent can be shown for the good in media, because you're right, he gets physically turned off if he doesn't get explicit consent from his partner, and he is so cool. He's one of the easier people to like on the show, and they purposefully made him a sex god.
Yeah, he's the sex symbol.
Yeah,
like in that episode where he wears that deep V.
Oh yeah, and
there's
Sella.
Oh, there's so deep, Marcy. It goes down to the navel.
Sella, there's this beautiful episode of Next Generation where they go to a planet where the gender roles are swapped.
That's the one I'm talking about.
So, like, all the women are in places of power and the menses are in, like, these really sexual outfits.
Yeah, it's a very silly episode.
I am now disappointed in myself for never having seen this show.
It's something that when you're around Colin, he like tricks you into watching it.
I do. I don't get anyone's consent before I make them start watching Star Trek. It's real bad. I'm really glad we got to talk about it. Although I will say, TNG's gender politics for the most part is very bad.
Yeah, it's not the best.
It's not even a product of its time. It's just
bad.
They have some cold takes, but it's still a good show.
So that's one example I had right off the bat. The second example I have is from Parks and Rec, which actually the show as a whole does a very good job of just being positive, uplifting, and a good example in more ways than one. And but the one example I'm going to specifically go to is Andy just finished his time at community college. He had one class, and he goes to a celebratory dinner with April, Ron, Chris, and his professor. And the professor is very attracted to Ron. She, at the very end of the dinner, Ron just finished 2 steaks in the manly way that he does. And he says, "Are we going to a second location for more food?" And the professor says to him, "Or the 2 of us could go back to my place and sleep together." And he says, "Yes, please." And the 2 of them leave.
That is a really good example.
That is a great example. Another show I haven't seen. I'm watching bad TV, guys.
Boy. 2 strikes.
So it is possible if you look for it. There are good examples out there. However, I think the overarching point is there are definitely more bad examples than there are good. So Colin, one thing about the interview with Hannah is I feel in most conversations regarding consent, they're usually very female focused.
Oh yeah.
What's your take on that?
There's a broad cultural idea that sex is something that men do to women instead of something that 2 or more people just do together. And I think that frames so much of our conversations about sex, even in like scare quotes woke circles, you know?
Yeah.
And I sort of lost my train of thought. What was your question again?
I guess have you had bad experiences regarding consent or women really not listening to you or kind of shaming you?
No, not really.
No?
Everyone that I have been with has been pretty good about obtaining consent. My problem was again about having a hard time saying yes when people did want to have sex with me. So
okay.
But men do of course face problems with consent, you know. There is a significant number of men who have been raped or sexually assaulted. You know, one person who has really inspired me recently has been Terry Crews, who has come out recently and been very vocal about how he was sexually assaulted. And it was all due to the power relationship between him and his assaulter. You know, he's sort of famously known for being a big, strong man, and yet he was, he was helpless to this to the person who hurt him. And there is the idea that men are always on for sex, that they couldn't, since we're so horny and we want sex so much that even when that our no is never a no, like we always have a presumed yes. And that is of course a very false belief that leads to putting all sorts of people into very uncomfortable situations and some awful situations.
So when you say there's this kind of stereotype that men are always down for sex,
yes,
when the answer is a no, do you think that the person who obtains that no tries to flip it on them through guilt?
Yeah, there's a little bit of like, I think partners tend to get hurt when a man says no. They say like, aren't you into me, or am I not attractive to you, or what's wrong with me? All of that sort of thing, instead of just saying, the answer could be as simple as, I had too much Indian food, and if we have sex, I will turn into a fart monster, and it will be very bad for both of us. Not that comes from personal experience or anything.
No, not at all.
Yeah, Chipotle is what's coming to mind for me.
And, more often than not, that's the answer. Like, you're just not down. Like, maybe you really just want to start Star Trek and chill.
Yeah, and I think part of that is also, instead of promoting men as these purely sexual beings, what they are is the same as a woman. We're all human beings, and we all get horny, or we all aren't. There are a million reasons to either say yes or no. It's just, we're just people.
Yeah, we just have wants and needs, and there's not always a correlation. Sometimes you just don't want to do something.
Well, something I definitely encountered growing through my early years was this idea that because I was a sex positive person that I was always down. And that's not the case. So
Yeah.
it is so common, and I think a lot of people have stories where they weren't listened to or respected, or someone had already made their mind up about how you felt about the situation.
I have been labeled like a sexual person probably since I was 10 years old. That has just been like put on me. Like, people look at me and they're like, oh, she is just that type. Like, from the age of 10, I remember boys grabbing my butt. Like, I have always been sexualized. So in high school, everybody thought that I was like a super, super sexual person. I didn't have sex until college.
I remember.
Yeah. And it was like this whole ordeal when I finally did, because part of me was like, oh, everybody already thinks I'm this person anyway. Like, why does it even matter? And like, for a teenager, yeah, I was getting down to third base, but the assumptions made about me in Salt Lake City, it was just so much pressure for not a lot of action, is the easiest way I can put it.
That sucks. That really sucks.
Preach.
Yeah.
So I guess in terms of consent and assumed consent, like, none of us are mind readers.
No.
And none of us know.
Well, some of us, like Deanna Troy.
None of us are mind readers. None of us know what's
Well,
going
she's an
down.
empath, not a mind reader.
Oh my god.
This is what marriage sounds like.
This is what marriage is. But, like, for Marcella to be an assumed slut at age 10 is so
That's
heartbreaking.
horrible.
Especially since I knew you in those days and you were a sweetheart.
Yeah.
Not to say that sluts aren't sweethearts, because they can be.
Yeah. We are. I am.
You are very sweet.
But
That's right.
It breaks my heart to hear your story, and it breaks my heart to hear of anyone's story where someone assumed anything about them, or they assumed consent. And so I guess the basic lesson I'm trying to get out of this is, you don't know anything about a person that you just started with.
Totally. In fact, I would go so far as to say you don't know anything, listener. You don't know anything.
This is how we screwed up the process. This is how we lost all of our followers. But no, I think you're right, Megan. And even in serious relationships, like, you may know the person, but you may not know their circumstances in that moment.
Exactly. When the Me Too movement was really in its starting run, and there were all these kind of sexual harassment facts coming out and rape facts, the one that really shook me was the percentage of rape in marriage, which is shockingly high. Like, this whole assumed belief that if you're married to someone, their body is yours to do with at will. That is so not true, and I think it is so against the theory of what a monogamous relationship should be, which is, it's a partnership. It is a partnership between two people who love and respect each other. And maybe they have social anxiety and they don't want to talk to other people. They found this person and they're never leaving their apartment again.
Yes, they just play video games together. Not together.
Yeah, separately.
Separately playing video games in the same room.
And so I want to touch on what consent looks like in a committed relationship. So I would say in the situation of Colin and I, we've been together forever.
7 years?
6.
Going on 7.
It's forever.
It's a while. Forever's a long time.
You know, we took it took us a hot second to really hit the ground running.
Mm-hmm.
But once we were there, we kind of had this established agreement that it was always a yes until it's a no.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot of comfort between the two of us that it's never ever been a problem when the answer's been no. It's like an immediate emergency brake has been pulled.
Yeah, parachute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Halt.
But of course that came after a lot of communication and getting to know each other. And yeah, I don't think that I'm not positive that attitude would work for everyone, even people who are married.
Agreed.
They might not have that level of communication, or they might not communicate in that way. So yeah, obviously sex in a long-term committed relationship is different when it comes to consent, but it does come, but still I would always err on the side of checking in and trying to get that explicit consent. And yeah,
I mean, I think you should be checking in on your partner regardless.
Yeah.
Right? Like, checking in doesn't just limit itself to sex. Like, you should check in and say, how was your day? Or you should check in and be like, hey, you had a design meeting today. Are you incredibly anxious?
Yeah. How are you feeling?
Yeah. You know, there's checking in on every single level. And I think keeping the doors of communication open will help your relationship in every aspect. It's not just about sex. It's communicating about everything.
Also, having a sex podcast really help. It's really a good way to communicate things with each other, and to learn a little bit together and learn about each other.
Looking at dirty books with pictures.
Looking at some smut.
Listener, I too am cringing at the cute.
So, I mean, Colin, were you as shocked as I was at the rate of rape in marriages?
Unfortunately, no.
No.
Well, because I've done a little digging on this, and marital rape isn't still very common, but it was like the norm for centuries. There was no such thing as consent for women, except for sex workers. We're gonna have to do that episode soon.
Yeah.
For centuries, marital rape was just the norm. Like, it was something you had to deal with, and you were lucky if you had a husband who listened to your wishes. Like, much less thought about your sexual pleasure, but just someone who was down for the no. And I don't have the stats on me, but after the no-fault divorce was introduced, rates of spousal abuse and marital rape plummeted. Because, and again, this doesn't apply 100% to women, but it was mostly women who were able to get out of bad relationships, bad abusive relationships.
Someone who cannot make rational, reasonable decisions because they lack the capacity to understand the who, what, when, where, why, or how of the situation cannot consent. This directly relates to when intoxicated, an individual cannot legally give consent. I am going to go on a limb here and assume that all 3 of the people in this podcast have had sex while drunk.
What?
My client does not recall.
Yeah. Just straight up yes. This was a really interesting part of the interview with Hannah for me. Because I feel like a lot of people use alcohol as a lubricant to embolden themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, I'm like, yeah, sure, great, good for you. But like she said, there is that line between like tipsy drinking and like inebriated and cannot make a decision, which is why it is such a gray area, and the best thing is to always be better safe than sorry. You know what I mean?
Totally.
So I'm gonna go out and say like something that I don't think I really listened to when I was in college, which is you should not engage in sex while you're drunk. It's just a bad idea.
Yeah.
It's probably the most common in a university setting, but I mean I've still done it long after leaving university.
Again, my client does not recall.
Oh God, that's really hard for me. Because I want to say, I mean, theoretically, I want to completely agree with you, but I've also had wonderful consenting times while drunk.
Agreed. One of our top 10 times is one of those times.
There you go. So it's I can't. I want to give that advice, but I don't know that I would feel comfortable saying it because I know that I am not, nor have I lived it.
Yeah, maybe it's a do as I say, not as I do sort of situation. But as you and Hannah both agreed in the interview, Megs, there is a bit of a gray area there, but it's so dicey and so gray, you know?
It's so dicey and it's so great because I think when I was single, like I turn into an unforgiving flirt when I'm drunk. And I think a lot of the times that was fine, but I can think of 2 examples in my past where it wasn't fine. And one of them was I had a slight crush on a friend of mine in college who was a very nice man, and he had a very lovely, very serious girlfriend that I think he's still with. And one night I just got obscenely drunk and like relentlessly hit on him, and it totally ruined our relationship.
Oh.
So I know that I'm guilty of intoxicated sex. I know that I still engage in it, but I think it's also safer because since I am in a committed relationship, that unforgiving flirt defaults to Colin. You know,
It does.
like
I get it.
Yeah, like the flirt always has a target.
I'm on the receiving end of that usually.
Yeah.
And I would like to point out that we've never had sex when we were like incapacitated.
100%. So it comes back to that first question of if you're not able to answer who, what, when, where, why.
Yeah.
A lot of people can be a certain level of drunk and still communicate on that level. I think at the point where you can't answer those questions, that is a hard
if you
line.
Can't answer, if you have a hard time answering any of those questions.
Yeah.
And I would say, if you even struggle with any of those questions, then that person can't consent.
Yeah.
But I think that one of the reasons why we're all struggling with this is because alcohol is such a part of the social framework of like everything. Like it's such a huge part of going out, and social drinking is a huge part of being a social person. And especially in college when everyone is so anxious and nervous and self-conscious, like
yep.
Like that's why they drink so much, because they're so scared, and then the opposite happens and it gets real sloppy. But
Sella?
No, I mean, it is not a gray area at all. If the person that you are trying to have sex with cannot answer your questions, that is not a person to have sex with. That is clear. That is absolutely clear. It's the way that it gets so complex is just like listening to how Hannah talked about, one drink for her, and it's a whole new world. Whereas like for me, I'd say that I'm not hitting a place where I shouldn't be making any decisions until like 6 or 7 drinks, but maybe I'm an alcoholic. Everything's fine. But I feel
on the time frame.
yeah. So yeah, no, I think it's complicated because you don't know. I guess it all comes down to like you really have to pay attention to your partner because you don't know what that level is for them.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've got to be really cautious when approaching these situations because the times that I've definitely felt like my consent wasn't heard or paid attention to or listened to 100% relate with alcohol.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I really like how Hannah characterized it as a date rape drug.
Yeah.
That's not a way I had ever thought about it before, but I think that's totally true in that it's probably the widest used date rape drug.
Well, I think, and also people literally use it for literal
for Rohypnol,
yeah. So alcohol, I think, is a very common one that people kind of fall under. How do we feel about drugs and sex? Like,
my client does not recall.
Oh God, this is Megan. You're calling us out.
Yeah, you're really.
I mean, so I think that. Oh gosh, speaking from my experience, I feel like if I am, or were I to use a drug and then have sex with someone, we typically would say ahead of time if that's our intention, like if we are going to sleep together. Mm-hmm. I definitely will say I have very, very limited experience of this. But I would say that I've had consent going into the situation more than I have with alcohol. I think in a perfect world you would be like, hey, I'm planning on boning you whether or not we have this 4th drink or not. But I feel like with drugs and my limited experience, I've actually kind of done that. I've been like, oh, let's do this together and enjoy the experience that comes out of it. So I think I've seen more consent in drug use than in alcohol.
Yeah, probably because we don't read alcohol as a drug on a typical occasion.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've never done any real drugs, and I don't know where I'm going with this.
The stoner from California has defined what is not real drugs.
I've only smoked plants that come from the ground, and only in states where their use was legal. You can quote me on that, FBI.
So yeah, what do you think about it?
I mean, I think it's got to come. It certainly depends on the drug and the dosage. Again, it's like being intoxicated with alcohol. There's a point where you are no longer capable. The only thing that I would worry about with drugs is that people are, in general, I would characterize them as less predictable. When they're engaging in drug use or drugs that aren't alcohol than, say, when they use alcohol. So I would be extra careful to watch out for the R in fries and make sure that it's fully retractable when you're not in, when your mind is altered. I mean, it's hard. I would err on the side of don't use drugs and then have sex because your mind is altered. You may not be thinking clearly. You might not be reacting you may not be reacting in ways that you would usually be reacting, and you may not perceive things as they actually are, and that's when it gets sketchy.
Yeah.
And I think I would have a tendency to agree, and mine is very personal based when it comes to drugs, just because with alcohol traditionally I know what's gonna happen. I know I've seen this movie before. I know how it's gonna play out. With drugs, I have no control. Like, I have no control of how that outcome. I either go completely within myself and don't respond to anything, or I am incredibly giggly or I am the most anxious person on the planet. And in all three of those scenarios, the idea of me having sex in them is just so terrifying to me.
Yeah.
I do want to say one final thing in this whole conversation regarding consent in every aspect that we've talked about it. If a person really wants to bone you,
they will tell you.
They will bone you.
Yes. Even if they're a recovering Protestant. Might take a little while.
So if you are with someone and they're intoxicated, if they really want to hook up with you, they will still want to do so once they sober
tomorrow.
up.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
If someone is really attracted to you, but for reasons they have a time frame that they want to stick to for sleeping with you first, allow them to have that time frame.
Yeah.
And you know what? If you really want to have sex with someone and they're not attracted to you, move on.
I will give you this advice. If you are wanting an enthusiastic response, like a verbal response from your partner, I love dirty talk, guys.
Yeah, exactly.
It'll help you.
So consent is very sexy.
Yes.
Yeah, especially when
hot.
Yeah, especially when you do it as dirty talk.
Mm-hmm.
Like, just say what you want to do, and then they will say yes or no.
Yeah.
Also, now the heart in me wants to say, also, it can be a really sensual moment, too. It can be very romantic as well. It doesn't have to be a hell yes. It could be, like, a very romantic asking your partner if they want to do this with you, and I feel like it can also warm their heart. Like, sex can be very intimate in that romantic way, and you can get awesome, great consent that is also romantic.
Absolutely. Like,
Totally.
when those moments when you're staring into the eyes of the person that you love, and you've got, like, either you're playing footsie with them under the table, or you've got a hand connect, or maybe you're not touching them at all. Maybe they're on the complete other side of the room. And, like, you've made that connection between each other, and you come up, and you do have that sweet moment of, would you like to go home and make love?
Yeah.
Which, saying that out loud when you're not in the moment is
Does
like...
sound cheesy.
Yeah. Makes you want to barf a little, but when you're actually into it, and you've got the gooey eyes and the butterfly stomach, it is really sweet.
When you're looking into your lover's eyes from across the podcast...
I shouldn't be here anymore.
How you holding up over there, Stella?
Well, I think it's probably time to wrap this up and let you guys go at it.
No, we're just going to fight about editing.
Yeah, we are. Okay, I think that's a wrap. I would like to thank you both for your time on this beautiful Saturday.
First episode in the bag.
If you join us next week, we will be talking about condoms.
Condoms.
Something that the three of us were not taught in public school.
No, good lord. Why didn't they do that?
Literal basics.
Very basic. OMG.
So we invite you to come back and join us for that. Whether you weren't taught about condoms or whether you were, you might learn a few things.
Something new. Come on, don't be so proud. We all have, none of us is perfect. Jeez, get off my back.
I am Megan.
I'm Marcella.
And I'm Colin.
And thank you for joining us.
You will agree that the concepts will contribute to the rearing of a mature person.
An absence of
Oh, yeah, you don't have to be thinking about sex.